Greetings, it's me, Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University again, and I'm recording this video on April 1st, 2020 during the COVID-19 quarantine crisis for my students in Religion 201, the Bible as Literature. It's week 12 of our course, and our topic is the narrative complex number 4, Jeremiah. For this, uncovering the story of the prophet Jeremiah, we're reading the book of Jeremiah. But we're also trying to understand Jeremiah within his historical context. And for that, we need to turn to materials that we find particularly in 2 Kings. I'm going to switch my view here to a little side image. I'll kind of put this off to the side here. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm asking everybody for some patience. Well, we're going to talk in this video about Josiah. And the reason why Josiah is significant for Jeremiah is quite simple. When we begin to read the book of Jeremiah, it starts with these words, which are found in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. The book opens by identifying it as the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of Yahweh came in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, and until the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. Now, although actually the book of Jeremiah documents some events in Jeremiah's life and some of his teachings or prophecies which may actually go past the end of King Zedekiah's reign, past the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month, this opening paragraph nevertheless gives us a sort of date range in which to think about the career of Jeremiah. He began his work during the reign of Josiah, the grandson of Manasseh, the son of Ammon, hence I call him on this list Josiah ben Ammon. And it began in the 13th year of Josiah's reign, that is the year 627 BC. It continued through the reigns of all four of Josiah's sons. Jehoahaz, who reigned only for a few months in the year 609 BCE. Jehoiakim, who reigned for 11 years from 609 to 598 BCE. Jehoiachin, who again reigned only a very short time in the year 598 BCE, and then Zedekiah, who reigned for again 11 years in the years 598 to 587 BCE. And after that, when Gedaliah became governor under Babylonians in Judah, Jeremiah continued to be active, and he was kidnapped and taken into Egypt with a group of rebels who murdered Gedaliah, the governor of the Babylonians. But that's for a later lecture. I'm going to show you this slide once again. This is the Nevi'im in the 7th to 6th century BCE, and it sketches out some of the most important rulers and the most important figures from the time of Hezekiah to the time of Jehoiakim. So not quite our entire period of Jeremiah's life. You'll see that Jeremiah is listed here in the third column, the prophets of Judah, and his reign, 627, or his work, his career, from 627 to 586, is listed there. And you can see that that places him in the midst of Josiah's reign. The dates here are slightly different than the ones that I gave elsewhere. Jehoahaz's reign, Jehoiakim's reign, Jehoiachin's reign, and then Zedekiah didn't make the list here in my slide, but that's all right. The most significant events in this period then are listed in the fourth column, or you can see actually, let's go back and look at the first column. In the first column, you can see that Jeremiah begins to be active right at the end of the reign of Ashurbanipal. The Assyrians continue to reign through one more emperor, Sinsharishkun. And after that, the Egyptians come to power with the fall of the city of Nineveh in the year 612. And you can see that over in the fourth column, events. Then Necho, who becomes pharaoh in Egypt in 610, briefly becomes dominant over Judah. He is associated with the reign of Jehoiakim. In fact, he deposes Josiah's son Jehoahaz in 609 and places Jehoiakim into power. More on this later. Well, let's look a little bit more closely at the reign of Josiah ben Ammon and think about what its relationship is to Jeremiah by looking at the material in 2 Kings that pertains to him. Now we're skipping over the story of Ammon ben Manasseh. There's not much to say about him. His story gets told in the scant 7 verses in chapter 21. Manasseh, as we saw in the previous lecture, is a terrible, evil king, according to the author of 2 Kings, the Deuteronomic historian who tells his story, finds in him the same cause of Jerusalem's downfall that later Jeremiah, or I should say earlier, because the author of 2 Kings is writing after the time of Jeremiah, that Jeremiah also had found. One thing to say about Ammon is that he reigned for only 2 or so years, and he was murdered by his own courtiers. He was murdered by people who were his own ministers and working at his court. And according to 2 Kings, the people of the land took his young son, 8-year-old Josiah, and acclaimed him as king. So Josiah must have had a regent that helped him rule. But by the time Jeremiah would have begun in the 13th year of Josiah, we don't know how old Jeremiah was at that time. Jeremiah chapter 1 suggests he may have been a young prophet, possibly even in his teens, in the 13th year of Josiah's reign. But we can think of them as close contemporaries, close in age, since Josiah began reigning when he was 8. By the time Jeremiah gets started in 627, Josiah would have been 21 years of age or so. So let's take a look at 2 Kings chapter 22 through chapter 23 and see the story of Josiah and think about how that might have shaped the career of Jeremiah. Although Jeremiah is said to have been active during the second half of Josiah's reign, and Josiah was active for nearly 31 years. During the second half, Jeremiah is said to have been active. Very few of Jeremiah's oracles can securely be dated to Josiah's reign. Mainly, it's that first verse in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 2 that links him to Josiah. Nevertheless, Josiah's concerns and Josiah's career still shape the context of Jeremiah, and as we'll see, they also shape the context of what comes to be called the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic historian's work and perspective. So I'm going to begin by reading. I'm going to gloss over certain parts, and I'm going to pause to interpret others. As we begin in verses 1 to 2 of chapter 22, we see that Josiah is one of the few kings who the Deuteronomic historian says was a great king or a good king. He did what was right in the sight of Yahweh. And he is compared here to David in many ways. Josiah's righteousness, according to the Deuteronomic historian, actually exceeded that of Hezekiah, his great-grandfather, the father of Manasseh. The problem is that Josiah's reign, even though Manasseh is his grandfather, Josiah's reign is under the shadow of Manasseh and his father, both of whom this author regards as being quite evil. You'll notice that Josiah is 8 years old, and then in 2 Kings 22:3 it says, in the 18th year of King Josiah. Now scholars debate whether or not this is 10 years after Josiah takes power, so 630, or Josiah's 18th year of his rule, which would be 622 BC. If it's the 18th year of his rule, then it's 5 years after the activity of Jeremiah. So far, of course, 2 Kings does not see fit to link Jeremiah's work to Josiah's reign. That's interesting. But let's go with the assumption that the 18th year of King Josiah refers to the year 622. So in 622, something very significant happens. Pause there for a second, though, and ask yourself, what happened in 627 to make it a significant year? 5 years before, the 13th year of Josiah's reign, when Jeremiah was said to become active. Well, in 627 BCE, what we know, or what we think we know, is that the Assyrian Empire began to destabilize. It began to fall apart, and it began to lose power it began to lose power over the kingdom of Babylon, which was a part of the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonian city-states that were in the southern part of Mesopotamia, chiefly the city Babylon, began to constitute itself into what would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this becomes evident in 627, when the city of Babylon rebels against the Assyrian Empire. It's possible that Jeremiah's earliest prophecies were in response to this international situation, where he takes note, in the name of Yahweh, of Babylon's beginning to rise against their Assyrian oppressors. It's interesting to think of Babylon in this role as a country that itself was once the subject people of a larger empire, the Assyrian Empire. Perhaps more on that later. It was Nabopolassar who, in the year 626, led a revolt against Assyria on behalf of the Babylonians. And Nabopolassar came to an independent power, this first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, against the Assyrians by taking power in Babylon in the year 625 BC. So I think that's an interesting coincidence to the 13th reign of Josiah that's worth checking out. It's 3 years after that, then, in 622 BCE, when we find ourselves in 2 Kings 22:3, in the 18th year of King Josiah. It says, the king sent Shaphan son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary, to the house of Yahweh, saying, go up to the high priest Hilkiah, and give him count the entire sum of money that had been brought into the house of Yahweh, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. Let it be given into the hand of the workers who have oversight of the house of Yahweh. Let them give it to the workers who are at the house of Yahweh, repairing the house, that is, to the carpenters, to the builders, to the masons, and let them use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the house. But no accounting shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into their hand, for they deal honestly. It's a strangely detailed account of Josiah's first significant act according to the Deuteronomic historian, 18 years into his reign, when he would have been 26 years of age. What we see here is a portrayal of Josiah as a king who was concerned about the status, or the state, I should say, of the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. He was concerned that it be properly ornamented, that it be properly constructed. He wanted to supply funds to those whose job it was to maintain it and to rebuild it. And so we find him here in 622 in the midst of a building project, really, a restoration of the temple. That in itself suggests that he's a person of piety and that he wants to serve Yahweh. It's certainly referred to as the house of Yahweh, and it is not referred to in any significant way as being a place of the worship of other deities that we heard that Manasseh had set up. But of course, what he will discover, what Josiah will discover when he begins to do this, is that in fact the temple is a defiled institution according to the law. But I get ahead of myself. So in the next little section, the next paragraph from 2 Kings 22, 8 to 10, what we see is that Hilkiah reports to Shaphan, who had been sent by the king, I have found the book of the law in the house of Yahweh. This book gets delivered to Josiah. He tells him about the money for the building project. And then in verse 10 he says, the priest Hilkiah has given me a book. Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. Now look at this. Hilkiah says, I found the book of the law. And it's just referred to as the book of the law. The Sefer HaTorah. Sefer HaTorah in Hebrew. The book of the law. And when in verse 10 Shaphan says to the king, the priest Hilkiah has given me a book. It's curious. It's as though, first of all, Shaphan says, I found the law, as if the law had been missing, or no one knew what the law was, or perhaps Hilkiah had never seen the book of the law. Why is he giving it to Shaphan? When Shaphan says, Hilkiah has given me a book, the king must say, what about this book? Shaphan reads it aloud. In the next paragraph, 2 Kings 22, 11 to 13, we get an interesting story about Josiah, who, here in his mid-20s, 18th year of his reign, apparently has zero familiarity with the Torah of Yahweh. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. The rending of one's garments in Israelite tradition is a physical sign of inward anguish and mourning. It is a sign that one knows one is has sins to atone for, or perhaps has been visited with a calamity. It's the kind of thing you would do if someone brought you the report that your child had died, for example, or that someone that you loved had died. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. In other words, for Josiah, hearing what is found in Torah brings him to a realization that something is gravely wrong. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and the king's servants Asaiah, saying, it's interesting, he gathers together a group of his ministers and he sends them on a mission. He says, go inquire of Yahweh for me, for the people, and for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of Yahweh that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. The scholars are puzzled by this because, as we saw, when the authors of 2 Kings tell the story of Manasseh, they fault Manasseh for not keeping the words of the law. But if this story is read literally as a record of Josiah's actions and the situation that Josiah was in during his time, then it would seem that the words of the law were not known either to Josiah or perhaps to his ancestors. And he doesn't just limit this to going back to Manasseh's time. The implication is that this book, having been found in this Torah that was found in the temple, and you ask yourself, well, how could you just misplace the Torah if the Torah is the center of religious life in Judah and in Israel and goes back to the days of Moses? How could it be just now found and just now understood as applying to the Israelites? The answer for many scholars of present day has been to understand this as a kind of new text that has been composed in Josiah's time by the priests and the partisans for Yahweh who are interested in reforming the religious life of Judah along a more strict Yahweh alone policy. In the next section, we find an interesting account of a woman who is serving as a prophet of Yahweh in the court of Josiah. Her name is Huldah. She is the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah. She resided in Jerusalem in the second quarter, where they consulted her. So when he sends his ministers to go inquire of Yahweh, they go to a prophetess. They ask her, what's the deal with this law? Should we trust it? Is this legit? Is this law legitimate? The prophetess says, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me. That's Josiah, of course. Thus says Yahweh, I will indeed bring disaster on this place and its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read. Because they have abandoned me and have made offerings to other gods, so that they have provoked me to anger with all the work of their hands, therefore my wrath will be kindled against this place, and it will not be quenched. But as to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of Yahweh, thus you shall say to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you have heard, because your heart was penitent, and you humbled yourself before Yahweh, when you heard how I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and because you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, says Yahweh. Therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. Your eyes shall not see the disaster that I will bring on this place. They took the message back to the king. So the story of Josiah opens with him in the midst of a building project where he is refurbishing the temple of Yahweh. And at this time, the priest and his ministers bring to him a law book that is not known. Inside the law book, we learn here by reading in between the lines, there is a prediction of a great disaster for Judah and Jerusalem because of idolatry, because of the worship of gods other than Yahweh. This is confirmed as a legitimate book of the law by the prophetess Huldah. She says these tragic predictions or warnings of a curse on Jerusalem for not following the words of the law are going to come to pass, but that Josiah, for his part, won't see it. It says he'll be gathered to his grave in peace, and it's interesting to note that even within this book, he is not gathered to his grave in peace. In fact, he dies murdered in war in 609 BC. That's later in this little lecture. So, what's going on, you might ask? Well, many scholars identify the book of the law that has been found here with Deuteronomy. Why, you might ask? It's because in the latter chapters of Deuteronomy, I believe it's chapter 28 in particular, and chapter 29, there is a series of clear premonitions of the exile. There are a set of clear warnings, curses that attend to the failure to perform the duties of the law. The text warns rather explicitly that the people of Judah will be subject to punishment if they don't follow the policy, the religious policies, and the social policies that are outlined in the book of Deuteronomy. Primarily, what Deuteronomy requires is centralization of the cult of Yahweh at one place where Yahweh will make his name to dwell. Remember that phrase from the story of Manasseh, this idea of where Yahweh's name dwells. This is found in the book of Deuteronomy. It doesn't specify Jerusalem as the place, but it does specify that Yahweh will make one place where his name dwells, and that worship outside of those precincts is not to be tolerated. Now, worship of Yahweh has, throughout the centuries of Israelite life, gone on in every locale where Israelites lived. But it's the ambition of Deuteronomy to centralize worship of Yahweh at one place, and that place is the temple in Jerusalem at Zion. So that's the main thing, is the centralization of the cult. But certainly also the prohibition of the worship of foreign deities, or any deity besides Yahweh, and this includes Baal, the Asherahs, and of course the host of heaven, and other things like that. And what does Josiah find? Well, we get into chapter 23, and chapter 23 documents the religious reforms of King Josiah of Judah. King Josiah of Judah is, in many ways, if you will, the first Deuteronomist. He is motivated to try to save Judah from the wrath of Yahweh. He's going to purify the cult of Yahweh at Jerusalem, and he's going to try to corral the worship of Yahweh and disempower people outside of Jerusalem who are leading rival sects or rival cults, cult centers. And this primarily means the Levite priests who are scattered throughout Israelite towns and who maintain places of worship on the high places. So, let's see what he does. The king directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. The king went up to the house of Yahweh, and with him went all the people of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. And this is a classic sort of Hebrew Scriptures covenant-making ceremonial preamble, which, because it suggests that all of the people are involved, it implicates the entire population in the program of rededication of the people to Yahweh. Josiah read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of Yahweh. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before Yahweh to follow Yahweh, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul. That's another clearly Deuteronomic line. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and you read the Shema, it begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." So with all his heart and with all his soul is a clear allusion to the language of the book of Deuteronomy. To perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book, all the people joined in the covenant. The king commanded the high priest Hilkiah, the priests of the second order, and the guardians of the threshold to bring out of the temple of Yahweh all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. Now it's interesting that he takes the ashes of these illicit idols, made of wood, made of precious stones, made of precious metals, burning them, he takes their ashes to Bethel. This was, of course, the famous site of the Jacobite or Israelite sanctuary, which was one of the chief rivals to Zion or Jerusalem as the place of centralized worship of Yahweh. He takes the ashes to Bethel. This helps to defile Bethel as a sacred site dedicated to Yahweh. Whereas Jacob promised to build a house to Yahweh at Bethel, Josiah is here being praised for defiling Bethel in favor of the power and the centrality of Zion. He deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places at the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem. Those also who made offerings to Baal, to the sun, the moon, the constellations, and all the hosts of the heavens. He brought out the image of Asherah from the house of Yahweh outside Jerusalem to the Wadi Kidron, burned it at the Wadi Kidron, beat it to dust, and threw the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. Now you might ask, why would he do such a thing? Why would he throw the ashes or the dust of this burned sacred pole, this Asherah, this concubine consort to Baal? Why would he defile the graves of the common people with this? It is as though the king is blaming the piety of the common people for the downfall of Judah and attempting to sort of spread the guilt around, if you will, a little bit by throwing that dust on the graves of the common people. It's a curious moment. Verse 7 is shocking to many. He broke down the houses of the male temple prostitutes that were in the house of Yahweh, where the women did weaving for Asherah. No one is quite sure what this is, but it seems to be a reference to a practice that is otherwise virtually unattested, but is comparable to practices that are known in Mesopotamian sites, namely temple prostitution. Male temple prostitutes and women who were weaving for Asherah may be an opportunity for some kind of ritual sexual activity in the temple prior to Josiah's reform. Josiah is not having any of that. He removes these illegal prostitutes from the temple. And in verse 8, he brought all of the priests out of the towns of Judah. Now these would be Levite priests whose ancestral duties as the Levites was to provide priestly services in the towns where Israelites were settled. He brought them out of the towns of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had made offerings, from Geba to Beer Sheba. This is the extent of his territory, all of Judah. He broke down the high places of the gates that were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were at the left of the gate of the city. Now back in verse 8, he brought all the priests out of the towns of Judah. This implies that what he did is actually, he centralizes Judean Levites at Jerusalem. He doesn't depose them. He brings them into the Jerusalem cult, perhaps attaching them to the temple and providing for some of the practices that would later happen among the priests. In other words, they would rotate their duties at the temple and so forth, but their activities on the high places, the traditional Bamoth, or locations where Yahweh was worshipped in the various towns of Judah, that is no longer going to be happening. The priests are going to be limited in their sacrificial offerings and their work to Jerusalem. The priests of the high places, however, did not come up to the altar of Yahweh in Jerusalem, but ate unleavened bread among their kindred. So this either implies that the priests were not given full access to the sacred spaces inside the temple for making sacrifices, or possibly it implies that they refused to come, but remained instead in their hometowns in a form of sort of mourning, eating unleavened bread. In verse 10 it says, he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one would make a son or a daughter pass through fire as a Molech offering. A better translation of this is a Molech offering. There isn't an ancient god we now know named Molech. Rather, certain Israelite peoples practiced this. We saw that Manasseh is said to have practiced this. They offered their children as burnt offerings that were known as Melech offerings or Molech offerings. These Molech offerings were a kind of offering to Yahweh of the offspring. We would regard this, of course, this practice as sick or as depraved, and certainly the law also regards it as sick and depraved. As Jeremiah will say, we'll see this, I think, in a moment. In fact, I'll just pull this up and see if I can find this for us really quickly. see if we can find... Oh, I think I paused my text somehow accidentally. I'm not exactly sure how much you missed, but I'm looking for... I'm trying to do a... I'm trying to do a search here, and it won't let me. For some reason, it's not compatible with this program that I'm looking at, so I'm just going to go back here to where I was. Trust me, Jeremiah condemns the practice of child sacrifice and has Yahweh complain to the people that he never asked for the sacrifice of their children. Apparently, what this means is that some people said that Yahweh did indeed ask for the sacrifice of children. You may compare the story of Abraham, who is said to have begun and been willing to sacrifice his son to Yahweh, but was prevented from doing so by an angel who informs him essentially that Yahweh was simply testing his faith. Verse 11, Josiah is said to have removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of Yahweh. Now this is fascinating because these horses are apparently live horses who pull chariots. It says he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. So there were chariots with horses dedicated to the sun god in the temple. It's not at all clear what this is, but it is evidence that at least the author of 2 Kings thinks people will understand these idolatrous practices or these non-Israelite or non-Yahwistic practices that Josiah is preventing. The altars on the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars that Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of Yahweh, he pulled down from there and broke in pieces and threw the rubble into the Wadi Kidron. The king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Destruction, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Astarte, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Shemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Now what this tells us is that prior to the days of Josiah, there were altars to Sidonian, Moabite, and Ammonite gods in the temple that Solomon had built for Yahweh. And before you think to yourself, well, that just represents a late corruption of this temple of Solomon, go back and look again at the last two chapters of the story of Solomon, chapters 10 and 11 of 1 Kings, and you'll realize that Solomon himself is said to have put altars to these non-Israelite gods in the house of Yahweh. It was, in fact, a temple for all nations, but not the way that the prophets envisioned it as being, with all nations flowing to understand the Torah of Yahweh, but instead with the gods of various nations that surrounded the Israelite peoples being honored in this temple. He broke the pillars in pieces, cut down the sacred poles, and covered the sites with human bones. So if you were wondering about how he defiled these sacred places that he was putting an end to, he did it by using human bones. The physical remains of humans are incredibly defiling if they're not handled properly. And so that's his solution to prevent worship of idolatrous worship at these sites, to ritually defile them with human remains. It goes on, 23:15. Moreover, the altar at Bethel, and here we are back at Ethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Now it's interesting that the author of 2 Kings does not seem to know of Bethel as a sacred site that was started by Jacob, but instead attributes Bethel and its altar to the activity of the first apostate king of Israel. After Israel split from Judah in the year 922, after the death of Solomon, Jeroboam is said to have placed a golden calf at Bethel and a golden calf at Dan, the two ends of his northern kingdom. Now, whether or not there was really a golden calf, or whether or not the author of 1 Kings is just trying to attribute to Jeroboam the same sort of sin that the Israelites are said to have committed in the wilderness, nobody knows for sure. But Jeroboam's sin is archetypal for Israel. And it is curious that here Bethel's is traced back to Jeroboam rather than to Jacob. The altar at Bethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin, he pulled down that altar along with the high place. He burned the high place, crushing it to dust. He also burned the sacred pole. As Josiah turned, he saw the tombs there on the mount, and he sent and took the bones out of the tombs, and burned them on the altar, and defiled it, according to the word of Yahweh that the man of God proclaimed. When Jeroboam stood by the altar at the festival, he turned and looked up at the tomb of the man of God who predicted these things. You can go back and see the story of Jeroboam earlier in the book of 1 Kings and his relationship with a pro-Yahweh prophet who is said to have opposed his actions. Then he said, this is Josiah, "What is that monument that I see?" The people of the city told him, "It is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and predicted these things that you have done against the altar at Bethel." He said, "Let him rest. Let no one move his bones." So they let his bones alone, with the bones of the prophet who came out of Samaria. Moreover, Josiah removed all the shrines of the high places that were in the towns of Samaria. Now, remember, Josiah reformed the high places of the towns of Judah, and he relocated those priests to Jerusalem. But let's see what he does with the high places in Samaria. Now, why Josiah has access to the neighboring kingdom of Samaria, it's not clear. Perhaps Samaria is still very, very weak in terms of its own jurisdiction after the conquest by the Assyrians more than a century before. In any case, he goes through the Israelite towns to the high places of Samaria, it says. He removed all the shrines of the high places that were in the towns of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made, provoking Yahweh to anger. He did to them just as he had done at Bethel. And then here the key verse, verse 20, he slaughtered on the altars all the priests of the high places who were there, and burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. It's an act of remarkable violence. Josiah kills the rival priests of the Samaritans, in the Israelite sacred places that he is defiling, and he defiles those altars to Yahweh that the Samaritans use, and their high places, these ancient Israelite high places. He defiles them by sacrificing the priests on these altars. This slaughter is a form of sacrifice. It's clear because he slaughters them on the altar. And to this, you might want to compare in the story of David, the moment when Samuel butchers the king of the Ammonites. The king of the Amalekites before Yahweh at Gilgal. The king commanded all the people, "Keep the Passover to Yahweh your God as prescribed in this book of the covenant." Now we see the Deuteronomic version of the Passover festival being observed. So all of this is connected to Passover. Very curious. And we're in the Passover season now. Here in April, Passover is upon us. It says, "No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or of the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to Yahweh in Jerusalem." Now, I'll leave it to you to interpret what it means by no such Passover. I mean, they had a very great Passover, and there hadn't ever been such a good one in all that time? The best one ever? Or does it mean this is really, in effect, the first Passover that has been celebrated according to the instructions of Torah? In other words, a kind of new ancient tradition. I'll leave it to you. It goes on. Josiah's reform includes the destruction of mediums, wizards, teraphim, which are a form of divination, idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, so that he established the words of the law that were written in the book that the priest Hilkiah had found in the house of Yahweh. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. This is very clearly a celebration of Josiah as literally the greatest of the Judahite kings, because of his adherence to the law as specified in the book of Deuteronomy. And that's clear again from this language of heart, soul, and might. To that, compare once again Deuteronomy chapter 6. Still, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. So in spite of the fact that Josiah does all of these things to reform the cult of Judah, the history with Manasseh is such that Josiah is not able to turn aside the fierce wrath of Yahweh. And that, my friends, is the real context of the career of Jeremiah, who, like Josiah, like the book of Deuteronomy, and like the authors of the Deuteronomic historian, sees the destruction of Jerusalem in the time of Jeremiah as inevitable. Now, it says here, the Lord said, Yahweh said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight. Also being an also to Israel, because Israel has been removed out of Yahweh's sight. And I will reject this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? They might be, but we don't have a copy of the annals of the kings of Judah. We have here a reference instead to the source that is used by the author of 2 Kings, who's not interested in all the deeds of Josiah in a 40-year span of his reign, but only of this one event in the 18th year of his reign, which is the religious reforms of Josiah. Very important. From the perspective of the Deuteronomist, this makes him the greatest of all Israelite kings. It literally wouldn't matter what else he did from the perspective of this author. It does, however, narrate his death. And his death comes about, as we know, in the year 609 BC. Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, he came to power in 610 and then began to expand his empire. Now what has taken place, and we'll go back over to my slides and pull them out. As I mentioned before, starting around the year 627, Assyrian dominance of Mesopotamia began to waver as the Neo-Babylonian kingdom began to rise. By the year 612, the Assyrians were finished. The city of Nineveh is captured by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians. And the city of Nineveh falls. And this is commemorated. This is commemorated in the book of Nahum, which is probably written shortly after 612, or in the very process of the invasion in 612. Nahum is essentially an Israelite prophet who is simply glorying in the destruction of the Assyrian capital Nineveh by the Babylonians in the year 612, seeing it as a form of Yahweh's justice. A jealous and avenging Elohim is Yahweh. Yahweh is avenging and wrathful. Yahweh takes vengeance on his adversaries and rages against his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger, but great in power, and Yahweh will by no means clear the guilty. There's no need to go in full over the story that's told in Nahum, or the oracles that are presented in Nahum. They're clearly and explicitly directed against Nineveh and against the Assyrians. It's just an interesting fact that this is noted, but not by the author, not at all. The fate of the Assyrians is not at all the concern of the author of Kings, which is only concerned with the question of the law and the observance of the law by the Israelite peoples. So Nineveh is captured in 612 and 610 in this power vacuum after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. The Egyptian king Necho arises. Pharaoh Necho, and here's a small bronze statuette of him, went to war with the Babylonians in an effort to establish his, or maybe it's not exactly clear who he's going to war with, but he calls on Judah to support him, and Josiah goes with Necho to face his Mesopotamian foes, Medes and Babylonians perhaps, or perhaps a remnant of the Assyrians, in the valley of Megiddo, in the Har Megiddo. And there, it says in 2 Kings that Josiah was treacherously killed by Pharaoh. So back to the book of Kings. 2 Kings. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, but when Pharaoh Necho met him at Megiddo, he killed him. It's just not at all clear from any of this what exactly transpired. Perhaps there's an echo of it somewhere in one of Jeremiah's oracles, obliquely. I'll let you to decide that. In chapter 23, verse 30, it says that Josiah's servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. The people of the land, that is, the common people in Judah, took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, anointed him, and made him king in place of his father. As we learn right here, and it's worth just sort of finishing the story of Josiah, who is so it's worth adding to this just the short story of Jehoahaz, the first of Josiah's son to become king after him. Jehoahaz was 23 when he began to reign, it says. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Verse 32 is formulaic for 2 Kings. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, just as his ancestors had done. His father was the greatest king ever and reigned for 30 years. Jehoahaz reigns for only 3 months, so he must have been evil. It does not, in fact, tell us anything at all about Jehoahaz or how in 3 months he could be said to have done what was evil. But one thing is certain, the text explains to us that Pharaoh Necho came and confined him at Riblah in the land of Hamath so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. In other words, Jehoahaz was removed from power by Necho, who had just killed his father. The people made Jehoahaz king, which would have only been appropriate, but Necho deposes him, confines him. And who does he place in his stead? It says, he imposed tribute on the land 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold, a lot of money. This formally makes Judah into an Egyptian vassal state. Beginning here in the year 609, Judah is under the thumb now of Egypt and a resurgent Egyptian empire led by Necho, Pharaoh Necho. It says, Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. So this is Jehoiakim, who will reign for about 11 years. But he took Jehoahaz away, he came to Egypt, and died there. Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land. In order to meet Pharaoh's demand for money, he extracted the silver and the gold from the people of the land, from all according to their assessment, to give it to Pharaoh Necho. So right off the bat, you know that Jehoiakim is going to be faulted as being a bad king because of his use of taxation to support the subordination of Judah to Egypt through paying tribute. More on the sons of Judah and the last decades of independent Judah, semi-independent Judah, in the next talk.